Among the most notorious exploration missions in history is the 1845 Franklin expedition. The crew's disappearance led to some unpleasant discoveries. Contrary to popular belief, this was not Franklin's first voyage. 20 years prior, Franklin had made other expeditions to the uncharted northern regions of North America, one of which is just as notorious, if not more so, for distinct reasons. The fact that a first-hand account can increase the harrowingness of a story, compared to one derived from archaeological evidence, makes it all the more horrible. After the Napoleonic Wars had passed and Europe had begun to recover, the British Navy looked for a new use for its enormous fleet in the early 19th century. Peace rendered the Navy's imposing ships and officers idle, despite the fact that the conflicts had altered boundaries and empires. The second Secretary of the Admiralty, Sir John Barrow, set his sights on the Northwest Passage during this transitional period. It was one of the most wanted exploration goals. The idea of a northern tunnel captivated European nations for centuries, but there was no proof. The discovery of whales in the Bering Strait with harpoons and scars from both the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans suggests a possible connection between the two regions. But the complex network of islands and icy seas beyond the northern coasts of Canada was still mostly uncharted. Europeans never visited the majority of beaches. Thus, the limited information available was based on indigenous knowledge and rare sightings. Thus, the Northwest Passage represented the possibility of tremendous economic and geopolitical influence for Barrow and his aspirations. The British might cement their worldwide domination by controlling a marine shortcut to Asia's riches, if they were able to map this route. Under Barrow's refocused leadership, the Admiralty ventured into the Arctic for the first time in 1818. But their efforts were in vain. Because he thought it was a dead-end bay, Captain John Ross sailed into Lancaster Sound, the supposed Northwest Passage doorway, but he turned around too soon. Simultaneously, explorer David Buchan tried to go straight to the North Pole, but came back with tales of unbreakable ice north of Spitsbergen, Norway, and nothing else. But Barrow would grow more resolute as a result of these setbacks, and the plan changed the next year. They subsequently organized 2 trips. William Edward Parry's initial expedition would try to enter the harbor via Lancaster Sound once more. In contrast, the other would head north, following the Coppermine River, to reach the Arctic shore. If everything proceeded as planned, the second party would have mapped the uncharted coastline and possibly even encountered the ships from the previous mission. John Franklin, a talented naval lieutenant at the time, was chosen by Barrow to command this ambitious overland expedition. In 1818, he was a member of the mission that failed under Buchan's command. You might recognize his name from another infamous expedition. In any case, Franklin's reputation for composure and resolve would serve him well in the trials that were to come, even though he had little experience with such severe circumstances. Along the trip, he was to record the secrets of a whole continent as he mapped its northern coast. That would mean the Northwest Passage was either real or a fable, depending on Franklin's journey. Once again, unlike Parry and Ross's first 2 maritime expeditions, Franklin's voyage would center on land travel across some of the most inhospitable and uncharted regions of North America. Since there were a lot of unknowns to face, the Admiralty gave Franklin broad directives, giving him a lot of leeway to make decisions. He set off from the mouth of the Coppermine River to chart the Arctic coast, with the hope of eventually arriving at Repulse Bay and linking up with Parry's ships there. However, he could always turn westward and map the coastline between the Coppermine and Mackenzie rivers if this proved to be too challenging due to weather conditions. Along with exploring, Franklin's crew was also supposed to collect specific information on the weather, the indigenous peoples they met, and the magnetic effects of the northern lights. The expedition's low funding made it all the more challenging for them to strike a balance between exploration and scientific discovery. Due to their limited means, Franklin's expedition relied substantially on the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, 2 rivals in the fur trade, for provisions, transportation, and trained labor. The indigenous Yellowknife people provided hunting and guiding services, while the renowned Métis explorers were employed as laborers and boatmen because of their extensive knowledge of the area. Franklin painstakingly chose a small yet competent group of 4 important men to assist in leading the voyage. As Franklin's deputy commanding officer, the first was the naturalist Dr. John Richardson, whose duties included collecting data on the Arctic's flora and fauna. Then, 2 young policemen, Robert Hood and George Back, would help with the journey's charting and documentation, which would include drawings and narratives. John Hepburn, a seasoned sailor and master problem solver, would lastly be in charge of the crew's practical needs and morale. These men would be the expedition's backbone, along with the indigenous guides and Métis explorers. After planning was complete, preparations began in early 1819, but problems immediately surfaced. Due to his limited funds, Franklin had to make do with whatever the fur trade companies could give, which meant he frequently had to rely on antiquated tools and inadequate food. A second complication was the animosity between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. Their competitive nature prevented them from truly collaborating with Franklin, and they often failed to deliver the promised support. Finally, the expedition boarded a supply ship owned by the Hudson's Bay Company and sailed away from Gravesend, England on May 23, 1819. However, the trip took an almost comical turn almost immediately. George Back got off the ship as it was docked off the Norfolk coast for personal reasons, but he was unintentionally left behind when the ship took advantage of favorable weather and departed without him. Fortunately, he swiftly boarded a stagecoach and a ferry to reach Orkney, Scotland, where the expedition was waiting for him. And this was only a tiny setback compared to everything else. Once they reached Canada, the true difficulties started to surface. The crew from York Factory on Hudson's Bay made an arduous 1,700-mile journey to Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories. They accomplished this by paddling and walking along well-established fur trade routes, making strategic stops at important trading sites. The trip inland, nevertheless, was as taxing as you might expect. Things were still tight, and a lot of the supplies that fur trading businesses had promised never even arrived. Franklin had to abandon some vital supplies at one point, hoping that help would be on the way, but help never came. Meanwhile, the hostile environment and uncertainty over the mission's outcome contributed to escalating tensions between the indigenous guides and Métis explorers. By the time Franklin and his men reached Cumberland House in Saskatchewan during the winter of 1819, it was obvious that the journey would be more of a test of endurance than an exploratory quest. There was little relief from the icy Canadian prairie winter at the modest trading post, which was just a log cabin housing 30 men from the Hudson's Bay Company. Hunting game was hard to come by, and supplies were already low. Noting that this was an exceptionally severe case of the flu, Doctors Richardson and Hood documented their ordeals in their journals. Fort Chipewyan in Alberta would be the next big stop for Franklin, Back, and Hepburn, so in early 1820, they set out to get supplies and more men. Once again, the trek was quite difficult. They trudged through thick pine forests and across frozen lakes, braving temperatures so extreme that their tea froze just after they poured it. Their thermometer's mercury apparently solidified as well. Furthermore, because they did not have access to tents, they slept exposed to the elements, sometimes even digging into snowdrifts to protect themselves from the wind. By the time they finally arrived at Fort Chipewyan in late March, they were mentally and physically drained and fully aware of the daunting obstacles ahead. At this point, they had barely covered half of their route. The harsh realities of life quickly dampened Franklin's optimism. The fur trading corporations, more concerned with their rivalry than the expedition's success, provided little assistance. The top explorers, crucial for navigating rivers and carrying supplies, were either too caught up in the fur trade battle to be spared or unwilling to take the risk of such a perilous voyage. Franklin did manage to assemble a company of 16 explorers, but they lacked the expertise many had anticipated. Since many lacked the stamina and skills necessary for the journey ahead, Franklin faced an increasingly uncertain future. Richardson and Hood may have rejoined the advance party in the spring, but by that point, the expedition had already moved on to Fort Providence, a distant outpost on the northern side of Great Slave Lake. Here, Franklin met the powerful Yellowknives First Nation chief, Akaicho, who had volunteered to serve as a guide and hunter. Despite his intelligence and practical outlook, Akaicho was quite skeptical of Franklin's lofty goal. After years of fruitless exploration, he began to doubt the supposed significance of discovering the Northwest Passage. If it was truly vital, he reasoned, we would have discovered it long ago. Even though he was hesitant, Akaicho decided to help, for a price. He wanted his people's obligations to the Northwest Company canceled, and firearms, ammunition, and tobacco provided to them by the British. Franklin, eager for guidance, reluctantly agreed to these conditions. In the end, Akaicho's familiarity with the terrain would greatly facilitate the months to come. With the mouth of the Coppermine River as their final objective, Franklin's group set off from Fort Providence in July 1820 to establish a winter base closer to their target. Under the leadership of Akaicho's band, the expedition traveled to a location near the Snare River, where they would eventually build Fort Enterprise. Originally intended as a supply station for their Arctic trek, this base consisted of a basic cluster of wooden houses. However, poor morale and food shortages plagued Fort Enterprise from the start. Even though Akaicho had promised to store dried meat for the winter, Franklin's men soon realized they would have to rely on the unpredictable hunting season to survive. One of the most harrowing chapters of their journey would unfold in the winter of 1820 to 1821. Food quickly became scarce, and Akaicho's hunters struggled to track down game. As the risk of starvation grew, so did tensions within the group. Franklin narrowly avoided a mutiny by threatening harsh punishment for disobedience. The mental toll of the ordeal increased as winter dragged on. Anxieties among the explorers and commanders deepened, as Franklin's optimism clashed with the grim reality of their situation. And yet, despite their suffering, they held on to the hope that they would eventually reach the Arctic shore and fulfill their mission. Little did they know, their struggles at Fort Enterprise were only the beginning. A fragile sense of renewal swept through the group as the spring of 1821 arrived. Determined to resume their trek, Franklin and his men set their sights northward after enduring months of bitter cold. On June 4th, despite dwindling supplies and mounting tensions, they pushed forward toward the mouth of the Coppermine River. Their goal, to explore eastward along the Arctic coastline. They set out with just 3 boats and enough food for 2 weeks, banking on the hope that they would find food caches along the way. But progress was painfully slow. Rough weather and rocky riverbeds repeatedly damaged the canoes, forcing time-consuming repairs. The land yielded little game, and the explorers grew restless. Franklin's frustration deepened when he realized that the Yellowknife guides were unfamiliar with the region. His trust in them eroded, fueling an air of distrust within the expedition. Still, they pressed on. On July 14th, they crossed the Arctic Circle, a bittersweet achievement. The shoreline was bleak, battered by relentless winds and obstructed by ice floes. There was no refuge, no food, no sign of hope. In desperation, the starving explorers sought to trade with the local Inuit. But the Inuit abandoned their settlements, perhaps fearing for their safety. What little remained in their empty shelters, rotting fish, dried birds, and dead mice, offered almost no sustenance. Driven by a relentless urge to chart new territory, Franklin pushed his men eastward, mapping an estimated 675 miles of coastline. On August 22nd, they reached a place they named Point Turnagain. The name was fitting. This was the moment Franklin admitted defeat. The canoes were beyond repair. The weather was worsening. Supplies had nearly run out. With heavy hearts, the expedition prepared for the grueling return journey. Rather than retracing their coastal route, Franklin made a desperate decision. They would head inland, across the desolate and ominously named Barren Lands. This was a desperate attempt to evade the impending winter. With no functional canoes, they had no other choice. The men set off on foot, carrying only what little supplies they had salvaged. Jagged rocks shredded their boots, leaving their feet bruised and bleeding. As the days passed, the cold grew more punishing. Starvation loomed ever closer. They ate whatever they could find. Lichens, scraps of decayed meat, even boiled leather from their spare boots. Desperation set in. Hunger and exhaustion soon led to open rebellion. Furious men smashed canoes and discarded their fishing nets. Yet, despite the turmoil, the group pressed on, determined to reach Fort Enterprise, where they hoped food and shelter awaited them. However, time was rapidly approaching. Early winter descended upon them, bringing frozen rivers and heavy snowfall. On September 26th, a brief moment of relief turned to despair when the men reached a large river, possibly the Coppermine, only to realize they needed boats to cross. Fort Enterprise lay just 40 miles beyond the other side. Desperate to reach safety, Dr. Richardson attempted to swim across. The icy current nearly swept him away. One of the explorers, overwhelmed by hopelessness, vanished into the wilderness. With no other option, The men fashioned a makeshift boat from willow branches and canvas, ferrying themselves across in stages. But the delay came at a terrible cost. 2 days later, some of the men collapsed, too weak to continue. 2 explorers lost consciousness and were left behind, presumed dead. With starvation closing in, Franklin made the agonizing decision to split the party. 3 voyageurs were sent ahead to Fort Enterprise to retrieve supplies. Meanwhile, Hood, Richardson, and Hepburn, too sick to travel, remained at camp, awaiting rescue. Franklin and the remaining explorers attempted to follow Back's advance party, but within hours, 4 men dropped out, choosing instead to return to Richardson's camp and wait for help. Of those 4, only Michel would return, under circumstances that would soon take a dark turn. On October 10th, Back's party reached Fort Enterprise, only to find it eerily empty. The supplies Acacho had promised were nowhere to be found. Desperate and disillusioned, they left Franklin a message and continued toward Fort Providence, hoping to secure help. 2 days later, the remnants of Franklin's party arrived at Fort Enterprise. The sight of the abandoned outpost confirmed their deepest fears. There was no food, no shelter, no hope. Weak and starving, the men tore up the floorboards for firewood. They boiled deerskin scraps, gnawed on lichen, anything to stay alive. And so, as winter tightened its grip, they waited. I patiently waited for rescue. He waited for salvation. Wait. As for Hood, Richardson, and Hepburn, they remained at camp. But something was seriously wrong. Michael's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He would disappear for long stretches, only to return with fresh, succulent cuts of meat. At first, the food was a welcome relief, but suspicion soon crept in. Michel hoarded what he had, refused to gather more, and offered conflicting accounts of its origin, claiming one moment that it came from a hare, then later insisting it was wolf meat. Then, they realized the unimaginable. Michel had turned to cannibalism. Their fears were confirmed on October 20th. They found Hood dead, suffering from a gunshot wound to the back of his skull. Michel insisted it was an accident, that his rifle had discharged while he was cleaning it. But the evidence, and his increasingly aggressive demeanor, told another story. For 3 agonizing days, Richardson and Hepburn lived in terror, waiting for Michel to strike again. Then an opportunity presented itself. While Michel was away gathering lichen, Richardson prepared his gun. When Michel returned, Richardson confronted him, then pulled the trigger. By the time Richardson and Hepburn arrived at Fort Enterprise on October 29th, their lives were in danger. The situation at the fort was just as grim. Too weak to hunt and with no sign of Back's rescue party, the remaining survivors were on the brink of death. On November 1st, 2 more explorers succumbed to starvation. Hepburn, one of the last men still standing, showed signs of severe edema, his body swollen from a devastating lack of protein. Hope was slipping away. Then, on November 7th, salvation arrived. 3 of Acacho's men reached the fort, bringing desperately needed supplies. They provided the survivors with fish, keeping them nourished until they regained enough strength to travel. After weeks of slow recovery, the group finally left Fort Enterprise in mid-November. On December 11th, they arrived at Fort Providence, ending their unimaginable ordeal. The legacy of the Coppermine expedition was complicated. The staggering human cost and lack of major accomplishments tarnished its reputation. By the time Franklin and his surviving men returned to York Factory in the summer of 1822, the reception was muted. The Hudson's Bay Company, weary of funding failed Arctic ventures, was particularly critical. George Simpson, a key figure in the company, was especially harsh in his assessment. He claimed Franklin was physically unfit for such expeditions, too dependent on food and rest, incapable of traveling more than 8 miles a day. A true leader, Simpson argued, would have abandoned the mission or changed course long before disaster struck. Instead, Franklin's unyielding determination had led his men to suffer. But by the time Franklin made his triumphant return to England in October 1822, public perception had shifted dramatically. His resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges elevated him to the status of a national hero. The Royal Society made him a fellow. The Admiralty promoted him to captain. His published account of the journey, released in 1823, became a bestseller. The harrowing details of his survival, including eating his own boots, cemented his reputation as the man who ate his boots, a grim testament to his will to live. Despite the horrors endured, the expedition achieved remarkable things. It mapped hundreds of miles of Arctic coastline and provided invaluable scientific and geographical data. Its brutal tale of survival captivated future explorers, including Roald Amundsen, who later credited Franklin's account as inspiration for his own Arctic ambitions. Franklin himself was undeterred. In 1825, just a year later, he led another, far more successful Arctic expedition alongside Richardson and Back. He continued mapping North America's coastline, before eventually serving as the lieutenant governor of Tasmania. Then, in 1845, came his final voyage, the doomed expedition that would seal his legacy. Franklin and his crew vanished into the Arctic, never to return. In the annals of Arctic exploration, the Coppermine expedition remains one of history's most harrowing survival stories. Defined by loss, suffering, and resilience, it pushed the limits of human endurance in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. To this day, Franklin's legacy is debated. Was he a reckless commander or a visionary explorer?